Thank you very much. Good evening to everyone. I'm particularly thankful for Prasho and my senior professor, uh, Shamana sir, for having me here. It's a great pleasure. Um, I think some of the job has been done by the state commissioner, so I don't go into that. But the fact is, put very quickly, when it comes to disability, there are too many definitions right from the beginning. I think this whole business of defining disability started way back in 1979. The WHO perhaps constituted a committee. They started calling us handicapped first, then they called us disabled, then we call them persons with disabilities. Now, a lot of new categories. In the whole process, if somebody like you want really to have the data, it becomes very, very difficult. So our first comprehensive disability law in India was in 1995. It's a long name, call it PWD Act. You had 7 disabilities. The definition is very interesting. It said disability means the following. They put blindness, hearing impairment, speech disability, mental illness, mental retardation, multiple disabilities, low vision, so on and so forth, and said, who is a person with disability? They had a different definition. They said anybody who has 40% of the disability, any of the above 40% disability. Very simple and straightforward. Come down to 2016, we have a new act, Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016. Of course, we had to do it in response to our signature to the UNCRPD way back in 2007. We are perhaps one of the first 5 countries to ratify the UNCRPD at that point of time. It's quite a significant step. But we took some time to enact a law that was in 2016. Interestingly, we have enhanced the disability categories, as the commissioner rightly pointed out, from 7 to 21, almost threefold increase. Perhaps in the original bill of 2014, there were 22 categories. Somehow one of them gone back. So 2021. And 21 categories apart, disability itself has been defined 3 ways. The first one, it's called persons with disabilities. Anybody who has a substantial barrier in terms of environment, culture, psychological, or cultural, they can identify themselves and call themselves as disabled people. That's what Section 2 of the RPWD Act says. Immediately, you then have something called person with benchmark disability. Simply, there's 2 important things in it. One is that you should be someone having at least 40% disability, and that 40% disability should be certified by a medical doctor. And of course, those disabilities should be specified in the schedule to the Act. There are 3 conditions one has to fulfill. This is a very technical, legal, and medical definition. Then you have something called person with disabilities having high support needs, who are basically people with benchmark disabilities, but who cannot do anything on their own. Then the Act has a schedule that actually talks about these 21 disabilities. The problem with these 21 disabilities, of course, the complexity, not a problem. The complexity is you have physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and there's something called blood disorders. So in 2011, when the census were conducted, it was a straightforward transaction. So 7 disabilities, and some of them they included in the census. But now if we were to conduct, I don't know when that is going to happen. I hope it will happen very soon. If we have to conduct, we have to include the disability question in census. That in itself is likely to become a separate set altogether. How are you going to accommodate these 3 sets of definitions and 21 specified list of disabilities? Right? I think something like what Murthy sir was sharing before, I was quite, there's something that we often come across, but we haven't really taken that into account. The Washington group consensus, you have something like this, which simplifies the census disaggregation. But the problem is when NFHS 5 was being conducted, some of the disability groups, we were vehement that it has to be included. Format, we thought we'll discuss it about later, but we at least told the government, include a disability in NFHS 5. But the question was, they said all this data is available in UDID cards. The data is available in different data sets. Therefore, there is no need to include that. So that we don't therefore have any disability disaggregated data after 2011 effectively. So now, where do you put all these numbers? All of us so far have all these numbers. I thought I would just tell you a small anecdote and actually perhaps conclude with that. Probably we will try and get some context to it. Otherwise, I think these numbers won't tell us the full story. The numbers are very important. For any scientific planning and its implementation, numbers are very important. But where do you put those numbers into context? I had a very young friend some 7, 8 years ago, who did his BSc, who did his mechanical engineering. He was at 98% in one of the JNTUs. And his practicals, he got around 99%. Everything was absolutely fine. Then he appeared for a DRDO exam, which is supposedly one of the most acclaimed, I heard perhaps quite late, most of the mechanical engineers really want to be there. It's a 7-stage test. He passed all those 7 stages, including the interview. Then the last test for them is what they call 3-dimensional sight. So you have to stand here and without moving your head, you should be able to say the things on all 3 sides. This is where he failed. Interestingly, then he was sent to a medical board to see if he was a disabled. But medical board said you are not a disabled because his blindness is 31%, which is 9% less than 40. So he is not legally blind because he doesn't have 40% blindness, nor he is allowed to actually go through the, perhaps he is not selected for the scientist engineer job either because he is not able to pass 3-dimensional test. So therefore, the story of the numbers and legality is a very complex one. Okay, we find the data, we get the data here. The law defines disability as 40%, but the organizations like this, for their own good reasons, have their own number requirement. So the 30% blind for them is blind altogether because you need 6 by 6. Even 20% would be blind for them. But legally, he's not blind. I think the number, therefore, the data collection, how do we take these things into, when the data comes to us, when the data is put before the government and before the organization, the program implementation organization, somewhere down the line, we have to really factor the real lives of people having difficulties. Somebody has less difficulty, somebody has more difficulty, complete difficulty at all. And how do we really address those things? And therefore, there is a need for non-governmental organizations, think tanks, and the governments. Of course, as Murtikar was rightly pointing out, even the organizations working with disabilities. So we have organizations almost for every disability, but there is hardly any interaction between these groups and between the civil society organizations. Of course, we keep going and talking to the government, but most of the time there is very little interaction with the civil society organization. Somewhere down the line, we have to bring these complex issues and bring them onto the table because the numbers, my strive is these numbers should always be put into context. Only then they can bring about the change in the real lives of the people for which we actually make these efforts. I think I will stop there. Thank you very much for having me here.